Hello, everyone. I'm frequently humbled and touched, motivated and encouraged when people contact me by email or texting or commenting, or they greet me on the street and tell me that my work has been transformative for them. If this has been the case for you, and also if you want to share it with other people, please consider supporting my work by joining my Patreon community. All financial support goes to the Vervaeke Foundation, where my team and I are diligently working to create the science, the practices, the teaching, and the communities. If you want to participate in my work, and many of you ask me that, how can I participate? How can I get involved? Then this is the way to do it. The Vervaeke Foundation is something that I'm creating with other people, and I'm trying to create something as virtuously as I possibly can. No grifting, no setting myself up as a guru. I want to try and make something really work so that people can support, participate, and find community by joining my Patreon. I hope you consider that this is a way in which you can make a difference and matter. Please consider joining my Patreon community at the link below. Thank you so very much for your time and attention. Welcome, everyone, to the Cognitive Science Show. This is episode 11 of Transcendent Naturalism. These episodes in this show just keep just growing in depth and breadth, and I'm loving it. I'm just loving it. So we have a special guest. For many of you, there's no introduction needed. This is Jordan Hall, and he's going to comment on the argument to date. And of course, my partner through all of the Cognitive Science shows, Gregg Henriques is here again. I'll just say a little bit about what happened last time, and then I'll pass it over to Gregg to explicate that even more, and that'll give us some continuity. And then Jordan is going to pick that up and lead into the main joint point at which he wants to make his case as a response to the proposal of transcendent naturalism. So the last two episodes were with a co-writer of mine, co-author with me, Brett Anderson. He and Mark Miller and I wrote the paper integrating predictive processing and relevance realization theory. He's been doing a lot, building on my suggestion that I did with Leo Ferraro in 2013 about self-organizing criticality and relevance realization, integrating all of that together with Jordan Peterson's idea about the monomyth as a form of self-organizing criticality, relevance realization going on at a more comprehensive level. So he's stitching my work, Gregg's work, and Jordan's work together, plus the work that he and I did with Mark. So very, very powerful framework. And he throws in some Nietzsche to spice things up with some nihilistic sauce. But he set things up very nicely in resonance to, I believe it was the third or the fourth episode with Gregg and I. We were talking more about the sacred dimension of this proposal, and Brett really gave some extra depth to that, and in some ways he therefore built upon there's a very interesting work that Brendan had been doing, Brendan Graham Dempsey. This is the way this is weaving and taking shape is really quite powerful, and I'm learning a lot along the way. And I'm now going to turn things over to Gregg, who will extend things even more, set Jordan up even more, and then we'll go into it.
Hey, this is really looking forward today. It's always a pleasure, but this one particularly special. You guys in particular were talking about, the religion that's not a religion for a long time. This transcendent naturalism, I think, sort of picks up that ball and looks to extend it. So I love the opportunity for the three of us to jam and jazz together around this. So in relationship to Brett in particular. And I think he really built off very nicely what Brendan Graham Dempsey was doing, both very consistent with the idea of where are we in building a worldview that can bridge science and spirituality and orient us going forward. Jordan, you and I talked, some about fifth joint point framing. I look to, kind of enrich that today. Some of the things that Brett really spoke to, which I know, Jordan, you'll be very familiar with, was the self-organizing criticality for the development of complexification. Very consistent with what we talked about in terms of sort of the ontology of nature and the nature of human epistemology conforming to that. He emphasized self-organizing criticality both as sort of the evolution of complexification and as, in some ways, a frame for consciousness itself, where consciousness is then found on the edge of order and chaos in a particular way. And then he connects, as John said, to maps of meaning and some of Jordan Peterson's work and sort of extracts a myth, the hero myth, and connects that to consciousness. And what he does there, to me, is he's sort of doing our science into mythos, framing, grounding that in a way that orients us towards meaning. And he is also very influenced by Nietzsche and sort of Nietzsche's call to see how do we situate ourselves in the problem of both fact and value, now so-called that God is dead, or how do we resurrect a conception of God that orients us towards the sacred and the transcendent. His series is Intimations of a New Worldview, and it speaks also to his own journey and invites us to consider ways we might think about both self-organizing criticality, consciousness, recursive relevance realization, and the hero myth and journey as ways to kind of organize that. And so that brings us to you in relation to the deep thinking you've done in relationship to where we find ourselves. And based on our conversation we had a week or so ago, I'm really looking forward to diving in and getting some of your thoughts and riffing and jamming accordingly.
Thank you. So maybe it's just a bit of a preamble. What I noticed when I was listening to some of the previous episodes is I had a visceral sensation of it's like three moves in a row. The first was, wow, this is great stuff. It really should become, let's say, kind of like a famous book. It should become famous. It should become like a movement in science or a movement in spirituality. And then the second thing I had was a very strong feeling of demoralization of like, oh, that's not going to happen. So I was quite curious, like, why? What's up with that? And then the last piece was I would say the insight that brings me to the topic that I think is going to be the interesting moment for our conversation. And that was that we're at the end of the moment of the book, at the construct that I was working with of how those kinds of things happen was essentially just a model on the arc going from, say, Newton as one of the earliest examples of somebody riding the rising tide of the book. Someone like Darwin is sitting in some sense peak book, right? The moment where the book was really clearing the field. And then you sort of think maybe, I don't know, Dawkins or somebody at the very tail end of the sort of the end of book. And there's a lot to that. And in fact, I would even go one step deeper, and we're going to move into the fifth joint point in a moment. We may actually be coming to the end of literacy. And there's an interesting linkage between the axial age, the two worlds mythology, and the era of literacy qua literacy. And so we can get our heads around effectively kind of flipping the story upside down from one that is oriented around ideas and thinking about and describing the world by means of very rigorous thought, and to one that's orienting around the non-ideal substrates, the material that conditions ideas, right? Of course, both of which have been discussed endlessly in the 19th century. And then, of course, the last piece is we're sitting in a conversation where we have one arc of transcendent naturalism, as you guys discussed it, I think, in the first and second episode. You also have the arc of big history as you were describing it, Greg, and the notion of joint points. And we've also brought in the notion of the meta-crisis, and I would dub this practical eschatology. Really needs to drop into the religion that's not a religion, practical eschatology that we are, in fact, more or less arguing on the basis of a substantial amount of theoretic and empirical work that the world is coming to an end and the end is nigh. And in fact, we have a description in the shape of the fifth joint point of something like what that end will look like. And my proposal is today, perhaps we can do the sitting astride that joint point and endeavor to participate in some fashion of what's the other side, like what's the other side of this thing. That's actually quite powerful if we think about it. We're bringing formal cause, we're bringing a teleological attractor that the arc of literacy and the arc of the work of the relationship between the media structures and the forms of mind that were both conditioned by those media and then making ideas that created further culture have a journey. They have the journey from the fourth joint point to the fifth joint point. And as we've accelerated towards this last moment where we're proximal to that fifth joint point, a lot of narrative arcs are coming to a close. So I feel like that might be a very nice place to spend some time, speaking about things that are frankly closer to my area of expertise, like where's the technology? What is it? Where is it going? What's it doing? Things like that. So let's see.
Yeah, can I just pause you right there just for a second? I deeply embrace and resonate with that framing. I'll just make a brief note as to how embedded it is in my enactments. And that is the book I just published doesn't mention this coin or garden at all, simply because I do feel, in a Marshall McLuhan sort of sense, I do feel we are absolutely on the cusp of a profound transformation of our relationship with each other and with technology. And the emergence of the digital globalization, we can think about the terminology perhaps of whatever the next or at least the medium of the next information processing communication network, and the implication that that has for our psyche is absolutely front and center. And your reflections on technology is exactly, well, a very, very poignant and powerful place to start to think about those interconnections.
I just want to grab what's happened now for me. I'm seeing that we with Rich and Rita, we laid out sort of ritual, and with Brendan, we started to lay out a cosmology, and then Brett took that almost like Aquinas, and now Jordan is supplying us with an eschatology, and we've already got the philosophy and the psychology. So we're doing pretty well at covering the basis of a of a religion that's not a religion, or the religion of the future. We can't use that though. That title's already been grabbed by somebody else. Right. I think it was but anyways, so I just wanted to say that it's interesting how this is sort of unfolding very naturally. We seem to be covering a lot of the dimensions of what is needed for a profound, proper, and proportioned ratio to reality, a ratio religio.
All right, so I want to propose, it's actually a little bit like our conversation on governance, John. I want to propose two concepts, and I don't think it'll take too long to lay them out, neither of which I'm particularly attached to, but I think they're helpful to begin the process of kind of like massaging our minds into thinking about this category in interesting ways. The first is a completely harebrained model of language, but I think it's fun, and I'll throw it out there. And in particular, in relationship to bringing in the consequences of our relationship with the technology that is coming. And that's kind of the point, to say, hey, what does it look like for us to think about the implications of these technologies that are now at our threshold? And then the second is what I'd like to do is maybe do a bit of a deep dive on this question of the digital. Like, what really is happening? What are we talking about here? And what are the implications of that in its most fundamental sense? Double click on most fundamental. So language. Here's the argument. The argument is that there are, in fact, properly three distinct modes of language. And the most fundamental mode of language, I'll call family language. So this is the language that an infant learns by being encultured with a group of other people that are speaking the same language. And in some sense, the essence of family language, and here I want to go way back to the actual emergence of language, is the coherence or the communion of the group of people, right? It's fundamentally about bonding, about relationship, and it's extraordinarily contextual. And this is a level of contextuality that we really don't have a relationship with. It has all the references to all the stories and all the references to all the people are shared by everybody in the group. Right? And so tone is 85% of what's happening, because the tone gives you context about the state of the individuals and what's the conversation we're having. This is the mother-infant language as extended to a larger group. The other two modes are almost like inverses of each other. Over here, we have what I've been calling the trade language. We could also call it the coordination language or the purposeful language, meaning that it is precisely defined by the fact that it is decontextualized from that larger, very, very rich context, and is focused on some location where either a narrow functional objective, like hunting together, or where in fact you're bringing into relationship groups that don't share the same language. And so you must reduce the complexity of the language and the complexity of the shared context down to something that can be shared. Say, for example, trade between two groups that don't speak the same language. So pidgin would be an example of a classic trade language. Here we have sacred language. And this is in the most conserved element we have of that right now is singing, or even just music, instrumental music. And the point here is that sacred language does not use the modality of propositions or the modality that we have. I have an idea in my head, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to use some kind of convert that idea into a kind of a token that many, many people can receive, and then convey it by means of some medium, in this case, speaking it to you, where you grab that token, you open up the box, you pull out the idea, and you load it in your head, like copying ideas, that sort of simple notion of memetics. That's more like trade language. That's not sacred language. Sacred language is more like attunement, right? Trying to get on the same page in a very deep way to come into group flow. The basic fundamentals of sacred language is something along those lines, coming into true communion. And by the way, oftentimes in a fashion that is deeper than just the human, like with our place and with our larger context, in which insights can flow. Benita Roy maybe the notion of collective insight practice might be an effort to bring back something like sacred language. And so historically, the argument is that when we began to move into a space that I've sometimes called game A, or cosmopolitan imperialism, where the primary political and historical is to grab different kin groups and stick them together into a new political construct, a state, say in the same city, those language modes begin to become problematized. Most specifically, if I actually have three groups that don't speak the same family language, but they have to actually interact with each other a lot, suddenly the role of trade language begins to become dominant. And what happens over historical time is trade language, in fact, the language we're speaking, English, so dominates that family language evaporates, and everybody actually learns what is actually fundamentally a pidgin, a trade language, a decontextualized language, as their family language. And by the way, as their sacred language. And so we now are in a circumstance where we actually think there's just one language, one mode of language, and we try to do all the things. So family, and you're trying to sort of do relational stuff with your spouse, you have to go through all this rigmarole of processing and disambiguation and clarification and building psychological and therapeutic constructs to be able to have something like the shared context that is natural to family language, because you're using, in fact, a trade language to do it. And even more so at the level of the sacred. And I think a lot of the notes that I noticed as you guys were going through is the real challenge of taking words like, say, faith or eschatology, which we can't help but intuitively perceive as being meaningful. But I want to raise the flag that if we're listening to them through trade language, we're already in the wrong mode to be interacting with what those things are truly about. And so the diligence and the carefulness and the effort to go very slowly and try to connect with the, let's say, the essence of what is being spoken, rather than the Derridian horizontal semantic relationships that are proper in a pidgin language would be that that piece. All right, so hold that, and we don't need to go too deeply into it because the next part is the part that is the payload. If we imagine now the role of large language models or of sophisticated AI, what I would propose or argue is that that can do the trade language thing qualitatively better than any trade language can. In other words, an LLM can sit in between us and translate between your language and my language, understanding, let's say you just speak French and I speak English, understanding French, understanding English, and translating back and forth instantaneously, right? We can go to do the Babelfish thing and I can just hear at like the UN, but even better, vastly better. And so by hypothesis, what this might do is it might break the binding or the domination of trade language, because now the best trade language is just translation by an AI, which, at least at the level of LLMs, has no domination preference. It's just it's a pure tool. It has currently no self-interest. It has no desire to create power. The companies that are using it might, but at least the technology by itself just does what it does. So we can now do the trade language thing. In fact, we could live in an arbitrarily large cosmopolitan environment, let's say like the internet, and not have to learn one dominant language. And by the way, think about that, dominant language to communicate. Instead, we can actually use our own language and have it be translated by a extremely effective and also neutral translator between us. Now, the spaciousness of that, has three consequences. One is it may actually begin to have an impact downward on the current constructs of imperial language and begin to break apart power and control that is actually just as a consequence of the limitations of having to use trade language as a way of interacting. And I believe that's the case, and we may even begin to be noticing that geopolitically. Second, and more interesting for me, is to then create space for the reestablishment of family language. Because at the end of the day, humans are still going to learn language from the human beings that they're their parents, right? The families that they're with. And I can imagine over a long arc, let's say over hundreds of thousands of years, a renaissance in tribal language. Right? We had the kind of the narrowing of the diversity of languages in the human cultural portfolio to what I would propose is maybe the low point now. But if what I'm arguing is correct, we'd actually see an opening because people can rediscover the value of highly nuanced local languages that are very bound to their actual lived context and their lived relationships, and get the enormous advantage of using something like that to communicate with each other, because it's no longer dominated by the necessities of trade language. And by the way, I would also say the same thing about sacred language. We may be able to rediscover that mode and reconnect with that mode. And that will open up, if the argument is even vaguely true, will open up a whole new set of possibilities for doing the spirituality thing and doing the religion thing and doing the sacred thing than trying to kludge our way through it using trade language and very careful argumentation and thought. Do we want to spend any time there, or do you want me to put the second concept in the middle and then we can go to the larger story?
I'd like to unpack that, the argument you've made so far. I've
Okay.
some questions. By the way, thank you for that. That was very clear. So the first question I have is, so when I think about family language, I think about something I talk about built on Reid Montague's idea of mutual modeling, that you get like my aunt and my uncle who, it looks like they have telepathy because they built, and what this and why, and the argument for this, it's not quite an a priori argument, but it's almost, is that you face this bind about any kind of communication. You're trying to, right, you're trying at one hand to communicate as much as you can to reduce cross-purpose interference, but you're trying to reduce communication because that eats up resources and time that you could be using to solve the problems that the communication is affording. And so Montague argues, well, what you have in an older couple, right, that they've stayed together because they love each other, not because they hate each other. It's easier just for imagery to use a straight couple. I'm not stating any moral or or even aesthetic preferences, just easier to talk that way. So here's the husband and the wife, and the husband has an internalized model of the wife has an internalized model of the husband. They can go off and not be communicating with each other. They just check in with the model, and that's how they get the benefits of not acting at cross purpose, but not spending a lot of time and energy just communicating. Now, the thing is, and that's where Montague leaves it, and he says the brain is basically doing that. It's doing that sort of mutual modeling, and there's evidence for that. So it seems like a plausible account of how that problem is solved, and that problem is sort of endemic. Now, what I added in is, and this goes in with sort of the cycling you get in predictive processing and deep learning and other things, is yeah, but what has to happen is periodically they got to come back together, right, and unplug from the world and just talk to each other so that their models don't get out of sync. And you have to actually cycle between these. And you see the brain actually cycling between these. It's task focused, and then it goes into default mode where all the modules talk to each other and make sure they're all in touch, and then back into the world, and it's just oscillating. And we do the same thing. The groups go out with their model, the map and model from the day, then they come back to the home base, and you can see this dynamic at multiple places. And so when I've been thinking about family language, I was thinking about, the way it can work, right, is you've got a very complex mutual modeling network going on, but that's very limited. Like you said, you only do this with a relatively, like I expect it hovers around a Dunbar level limitation, because you get too many people and you just have to move to a generalized other, the way Mead talked about. You can't just have like, what does Peter think and what does Susan think? And so I think I'm making a proposal, and then on the basis of the proposal question, I'm proposing that I think the fundamental machinery of family language that makes it so tone sensitive and tone based, because it is so pragmatic and contextually sensitive, it's almost telepathic. That's its power, is that mutual modeling. And that's my proposal. Here's the underlying mechanism what you're talking about. And then that leads to the question, and I think you might have an answer to this in the Civium proposal, but I think that family language, I'll pun here a little bit, requires a profound kind of familiarity in the way I'm talking about. So while I think the LLMs may be a necessary condition for the reemergence or the reprioritization of family language, I don't think they could be sufficient. People would have to go back to living together in more socially intimate fashion in order for that mutual modeling to be practiced, because it takes time, and be rich and sophisticated enough to bring back what family language was. So that's my proposal and the question. What do you think of that?
I agree with both. I would expand on the first point a little bit, and if you use the metaphor, if you actually do the exact opposite point of life, from the old married couple to the mother with the newborn baby, the diversity of mediations of expression and relationality. Yeah. Again, in trade language, we tend to have this notion that language has to do with words issued by lips and heard by ears. But as we know, of course, a baby doesn't have those, and a mother understands quite well what the baby is endeavoring to express, and oftentimes vice versa. So that's like, so when the husband and wife are kind of coming back into relationship, they're also activating this extraordinarily large portfolio. Yeah, and different modes of expression are different ways of they hold different things differently. It's very difficult to sort of express your love using words when you can express it with touch, for example. It's just different.
Yeah, and they convey a lot.
You have all of that.
Yeah, they convey a lot with a gesture or a look, or even a raise of an eyebrow. There's all that kind of thing going on. Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's a recovery of something profound about the dialogue, of the inherently dialogical nature of cognition and the formation of self, and how those get linked together. So given that that's the case, doesn't the proposal require something like your Civium proposal, that we now have the LLMs and the trade language running in the network on the internet, but we drop into psychological, physiological, and ecologically healthy small-scale communities where we live together in this family language orientation. It seems to me that it almost requires something like that.
Now that you mention it, I think it's probably worthwhile fleshing that out a little bit.
Yeah, yes, please.
And I think just to kind of make sure that we're in this shared context, we are in fact talking about a practical eschatology. So
yes.
we have a theoretical model that proposes that changes like the ones we're talking about are actually happening. Right? So this is not a theoretical exercise. We're saying, no, we're racing towards this thing. Perhaps we should come to terms with it as best as we can so we can make the best choices we can in relationship with what's just coming. So we should keep that in mind. Like for those who are listening, no, this is not a conversation about neato ideas. It's actually, a diagnosis of maybe what's really happening. So the argument in the larger context of civism, and you said it just right, things of that sort. So okay. So the argument in the larger context of civium is that the city was fundamentally a consequence of what we now know as Metcalfe's law. Mm-hmm. That there is a exponential generativity that occurs when minds come into communications networks, and that way back in the old days, the only way to get minds and communications networks in any density was to get bodies into physical proximity. And that there was a problematic of the tension between things like Dunbar family and the ability for those things to be very coherent, and the desire to scale more bodies into the same location. And the resolution to that, a 10,000-year temporary resolution to that, was the invention of what I call Game A, which is also the city, civilization, and cosmopolitan imperialism. Those are all different ways of looking at the same thing.
And trade language, I would add now to that argument.
And trade language as used as a dominant language.
Yes.
Dominant.
Mm-hmm. And those are all part of a complex of solutions to move more minds into communications networks to take advantage of that exponential. That exponential is very powerful, and it shows up at least in the category of wealth and innovation. So as you put more minds into those networks, you increase wealth. Every time you double the size of a group, you increase the wealth per capita by 15%, which is a lot, compounding as you keep doubling. And you increase innovation per capita by about 15%. So that's a lot. And that's a very powerful centripetal force pulling population into centers, and then dealing with the centrifugal force of how are you going to feed all these people? How are you going to bring water? How are you going to move waste out? How are you going to give them housing, right? And so the arc and the movement of city and civilization was that set of tensions. And by the way, I propose that the reason why I collapse city and civilization is that all roads really do lead to Rome, that the entire Roman Empire is a single body, and the entire territory is a giant territorialized system, move resources ultimately necessary to support Rome qua Rome at the top of that pyramid. And we're now reaching the end of that too. And the ability for minds to enter into communications in a fashion which is almost entirely ephemeralizing the necessity for us to our bodies performatively this moment right here. And we're in completely different geographic locations, and we're communicating. It's not as rich. We can't do family language, right? We can't do that rich, high bandwidth, but it's pretty good. And the argument is it's good enough, or soon will be good enough, that again, that binding, that generator that has produced history is about to become broken, which then produces a different energy on where history goes. Right? So now we get to the Civium proposal. And I don't think it's obligatory, by the way. There may be a fork here. There may be two basic different approaches of shooting through that fifth joint point. And I'm very much arguing in favor of this one. This one would be known as strong transhumanism. So this would be, we become cyborgs and then we upload into the computer and sort of become pure information. I think that's a terrible idea, but so I'll just argue this is at least one possibility and the one that I'd like to propose. As you move over here, those more fundamental needs of humanness, needs of relationality, needs of connection to space, needs of mythos as embodied mythos, those are still there, right? We're still, for as long as we're bodies, those needs come up, which are grounding meaningfulness, right? That's that fruction underneath here. And those become attractors to start pulling people like, and as the minds, as the ideas are like, well, if those are things you yearn for, and maybe have been yearning for your whole life, go here, right? If somebody properly designs something, says, here's a way to get those needs met. And if you go there, and you discover A, that those yearnings are satisfied, and B, that you're not losing anything by virtue of leaving the city, for example, that you maybe are afraid of losing, that begins to propagate. And so the argument is that because those are so fundamental, and by the way, because they are catastrophically disrupted by the urbanization construct, people will, once released from that pulling force, will begin to drift back down into something that looks like, let's say, Dunbar. Right? And so those two forces then cross. Family language will begin to become supported because trade language no longer is necessary or dominant, and because people will be spending more and more embodied time with familiarity with each other and with the land and the context that they live in. So that's a prediction about what things look like either on the other side of the fifth joint point or as part of our movement through it. I'll make a strong argument for that last part in a moment, that there's a minimum viable capacity to do the things we need to do to make it through the fifth joint point is actually geometrically associated with a new network topology, like family language, familiarity, whole humans in wholesome relationships with each other and Earth, but also connected via properly designed networks. So that's a big sort of box that I just described, and we may or may not get to it today. Maybe we'll do it in another conversation. So let me do the other concept, and this has to do with trying to do a deep dive into the digital. I think it's proper to say that something fundamental is going on in the movement across the threshold in the fifth joint point, but I think we need to come to terms with what we're really dealing with, like the digital qua digital. And I think, Greg, you and I had a conversation here. I'll use some of the ideas that came out of that. I want to put over here the basic function of the human mind in relationship with complex reality, i.e. modeling. And I want to put over here the notion of the digital as what it is. And my proposal is that these are like the alpha and the omega, that they fundamentally are doing the same thing. And by virtue of finally making our way to digital, we've essentially closed the arc of the relationship between the mind with complex reality. And that's so the arc of that fourth joint point of minded bodies moving into this new space. It begins with the ability to create a simulation or a model of complex reality, which by its very nature is a map, not the territory, meaning by its very nature, it foregrounds certain aspects, backgrounds other aspects, and critically elides effectively everything else. Like if I can't include the infinity of reality, if I'm trying to model, I have to actually create a quantized or reduced or complicated construct that captures the parts that I care about. Now, of course, as we all know, there's a lot of power in that. The ability to foreground allows you to optimize, allows you to extract characteristics, to be able to find principles that allows you to, that's the whole thing. And we talked about the role of books and the role of different kinds of mediating technologies. And we can notice that mediating technologies figure or embody certain aspects of model. The book is governed by, let's say, linearity. And if it's in English or in a Western language, it's alphabetic linearity. If it's in Chinese or an Eastern language, it's a different kind of linearity. And the media structure, the analog media structures, the form of the media structure imposes itself on the shape or nature of the model or simulation or the kind of mental relationship with complex reality that's possible. When we finally get into digital, we actually do two moves simultaneously. One, in some sense, the most obvious, is that digital is pure simulation. In other words, it can be a book, it can be a video, it can be a song, it can be a combination of things, right? It can be AI. It actually has no particular binding to a media form. It is polymorphic. It can be all and any and new ones that we've never even experienced before, which means we're now able to explore, by virtue of the digital, the whole portfolio of all possible ways of mediating, which means, therefore, all the different variations on how media configures our models and mental capacities. That's one aspect of what's happening when we move to the digital field. And by the way, we're seeing this now with LLMs as we're beginning to discover that the notion of language is diverse, and that LLMs become more powerful as you connect different media forms to each other through the medium of language, right? So LLMs that no longer just do text, but can also speak and hear, and can see, and can create images, and can create video, right? They're naturally going to expand to cover possibly the entire portfolio of what can be mediated by sense and expressed by sense. Then the other side, the orthogonal, is if I get dropped down to the very essence of the notion of digital, what I'm actually talking about is discontinuity qua discontinuity. I'm talking about sampling. I'm talking about quantitization. I'm talking about the extraction of some finite component from the infinite context of the whole. That's what digitization literally just is, which is at its bottom the base or the fundamental characteristic of mind and modeling in relationship with complex reality. Right. So the argument is that we're actually reaching something that is the most pure, the most basic, most abstract or reified element of what we've been exploring for this entire period of time in the context of mind. So we have three elements. We've got the entire portfolio of modes of expression, which we can now play with no particular limitation. We have the notion of the essence of quantitization or decontextualization. And then we have the algorithmic relationship of some construct of these kinds of things that produce models of and represent complex reality. So that's the argument is we've now reached that point. And that is, again, at the very essence of the joint point. And when we say the joint point has something to do with the digital, what I would say is that it has something to do with us at long last finally and fully coming to terms with the consequences and the potency of this thing in relationship with complex reality, and are able to finally bring it back into a stable and wholesome relationship with complex reality. And maybe just to loop that last part, if we say metacrisis, one might well argue that a major through line of metacrisis is precisely the destabilizing elements of this triangle in relationship with complex reality. The tainter. The entire tainter argument ultimately boils down to this: the inexorable self-termination of game theoretic arms races and escalating technology curves. It's this, right? This is the key thing. And if we can't resolve this, then the metacrisis is quite likely terminal through Oppenheimer effects. You guys watch Oppenheimer yet?
I haven't. We spoke about it. I haven't yet.
Yeah, darn. Well, remember we actually went to some depth about that last scene. So if you happen to be watching this and you've seen the last scene, the argument I'm making is that whether or not Oppenheimer himself, frankly, ever said it, or whether Nolan intended this, the meaning I'm putting on top of it is he was seeing the notion of filling the space where we don't kill ourselves as we race down just the basic logic of game theory, arms race, and the way that technology becomes exponential because it builds on itself. So he had at the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos, they passed through the first point where ordinary arms races in the kind of pre-20th century sense, which led to conflict but didn't lead to the end of everything, could suddenly for the first time lead to the end of everything. But if he's looking at it and he's thinking about the implications of, well, if I've got an A bomb, then they've got to get an A bomb. Therefore, I've got to get an H bomb. And now the risk of things getting worse just went up. But if I've got an H bomb, they've got to get an H bomb. And if we lock in around not nuking each other, all that means is that everybody's now looking for other ways to compete in the same basic field. And so, yeah, drones aren't necessarily as dangerous as H bombs, but there's a point at which drone technology is sophisticated enough and powerful enough that it actually can be extinguishing. There's a point at which AI becomes extinguished, the point at which genetic engineering becomes extinguishing. And so if you see that box, the box fills. The box represents the volume of the space where we're filling more powerful technologies in an arms race, but don't kill ourselves. As it fills, we pin ourselves into a corner. So that's kind of the Oppenheimer effect. I'm putting all that in to say the way to resolve that is to resolve this triangle. It was at the birth of humanity into complex nature, and these three characteristics. And practically speaking, we don't make it to the fifth joint point if we don't solve it. But equally practically speaking, therefore, the essence of moving to the fifth joint point must include whatever that resolution looks like. All right, there, I'm done spewing words at you. I apologize.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that I'd just like to draw some attention to. I mentioned this briefly in our conversation. One thing that I was struck by just at a parallel level, then I'll come back to what I see in terms of the architecture that you've laid out and how it speaks to me in relationship to kind of resolving, or at least the problem before us, that if we get successfully through the fifth joint point, it will indeed involve resolving very much the kind of dynamics that you lay out. So one of the things that I'm reminded of, John, I'll be curious if you pick this up too, but when we did the conversation with Zach Stein, and he gave his meta-psychology, identified 3 sort of vectors of the psyche. He didn't do it strongly, but he thought it was very useful. One is essentially the doing cognitive skill vector of sort of control. And then that's going to generalize to the capacity of things sort of have logical impacts, inevitable, practical, logical impacts on the environment. And to me, that's kind of where trade language then would find its grip in relationship to what are the practical implications of doing in the world. And then there was ensoulment, which then connected very much to the felt sense of your image-based relations, in particular self and other in the world, and managing that, and then ultimately transcendence, which is sort of an essential connection to the spiritual, and ultimate sacred, transcending our human condition at whatever level into beyond forms, into essential forms, etc. So anyway, the sacred, trade, and family languages seem to be perhaps sort of the ways in which systems of justification or human attunement might be parallel to some of what Zach was saying. So I'll just throw that out there to see some parallels or resonance. For me, when I think about the 5th joint point, I think you've really captured it very nicely. The nature of this sort of absolute medium and its potential and power and its tremendous threat is well stated in the architecture that you've laid out. I think you cut to the core of some of these dynamics and then spell out, okay, what are the challenges and what are the dynamics that we need to resolve? One of the things that I'm wondering about what you're thinking when you say, okay, as trade language gets regulated and instantiated in this process, it gives the opportunity for more family language. Do you see that as something that's sort of an inevitable attractor state, or do you see that's something that has to be sort of engineered? Like we have to figure out how to create the eddies of connection, like systematic Civium projects, or ways that afford us the capacity to be engaged in the relations with others? Or do you think that the nature of or depending on how it evolves, it will afford an opportunity as it takes over in sort of a trade language, a natural space will open up for us to be drawn into family language as like, is this going to be a really hard push thing up the hill kind of deal to get happening? Or is this, do you envision this more as an unfolding that we may be able to slide into comfortably without a lot of hard engineering?
Okay, so that last little bit, first order, I would say that I would propose that it is an attractor,
okay,
but attractors aren't certain. If I have a divot in the floor and I push a marble towards it, there's an attractor, but if the marble's off or fast, it'll pop in and out. Right.
So, in fact, we dialogued about this exactly with Brett Anderson. We had exactly that model and metaphor. So we were building off of that for sure. Okay.
So it's a powerful attractor. And we're sitting in an environment that has a lot of energy and has a lot of energy, both in terms of kinetics, lots of stuff going on that people are connected to, and in terms of cognition, psychology, paradigmatic. People have a lot of preconceived notions about what the good life looks like or how to accomplish different needs. And so I would sort of aesthetically and ethically propose that there will be a design characteristic where human beings may see this as a possibility. Maybe they themselves are yearning for it. And to even just satisfy their own needs, they engage in an effort work of design and construction. But actually it's art ultimately, but by virtue of doing that, that both becomes more energetically available. It's a real thing that people can participate in. And it becomes more an idea that becomes clearer, and you get a reciprocal movement. And so the attractor attracts, the attraction manifests and deepens the attractor, and there's a series of co-creating forces that bring it into reality. The last bit that made me laugh was, in some sense, obviously, if we actually try to apply a strong design methodology, we'll simply reify the complicated structures of trade language on top of this thing, and it can't be that kind of thing. We have to actually relearn how to dance with these things and how to actually sort of midwife or co-create things that are part of the ambient environment, let's say gently, and not design down on top of them. Otherwise, we'll just repeat the same sort of circumstances.
Lovely. I'll say one more thing and then I'll pass it over to John. And you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past, so it's not new to you, but it's so embedded in the unified theories frame for our human relationship system is the core barometer of both social influence, which is this pragmatic capacity to influence others in accordance with our interests, and the felt sense of relational value. So this is when two people are together, it's because the wife knows the husband and she doesn't leave the husband when he gets dementia because he has particular value. And the argument that I have is the human heart needs to be seen, known, and valued and have social influence. Yet the trade language structure, especially capital labor structure, basically turned us into, influencers. And there are aspects of the digital world that are doing that, of course, also. But there is, I believe, the human soul is craving, to use a sort of an exact science sense, or the ensoulment side, is craving the need to be seen, known, and valued. And at some level, if we can at least wake that up, that consciousness, and then find some opportunity for that to coalesce and then manifest itself in the lived experiences of real relation, that is the way I would at least point to it without top-down trading it, as it were.
Nice.
Thank you, Greg. That last point was very helpful to me. It clarified some things. So, Jordan, I'm wondering. I want to. First of all, I want to make sure I get sort of the incisive point of the second, the digital, and then I want to get clear about what the connection of the first and the second point are, because I feel those two things are related. If I get a good answer to the first, I'll get a good answer to the second, and vice versa. So, it was the main claim that the digital is moving to something that it is multidimensional, polymorphous, I believe you said, and that that's a complete arc. I mean, you're not saying, of course, it will have infinite capacities or anything like that, or it still won't face the bias variance problem or anything like that. But you're saying, like, there won't be any dimension of our experience that won't be digitized in some important way when we're trying in communication. I'm trying to get like what's the, you've said the quantitative difference, you laid it out very clearly. I want to know the qualitative difference. What's the move here? Like, because we're talking about a joint point, right? We're talking about how it's not just, it's a more that becomes an other. That's in Gregg's model. Whenever when we pass from inorganic to life, it's not just more, it's other. When we pass from life, right, it's not just more, it's other.
More is different to use.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and I got the more, but I didn't quite catch the different, the other, the novelty, and how that relates to the first point about the demise of trade language imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
Was that a clear question? Was that clear?
Sure, of course. It was very important because it, I guess the key point that I want to make about the notion of the digital is that, and by the way, this has been going on since the birth of the internet. For the most part, I've noticed that most people perceive the digital as being, call it, yet another medium.
Yes.
So you say,
yes.
The internet is kind of like the yellow pages. We've got books, we did print. The argument I'm making is that no, it's actually the final, perfectly purified, reified essence of what all media have always been.
So it's like it's the platonic form of media.
It's the embodied, right? The actual platonic, which is a very interesting thing, right? Okay. But you can't go any further down that road because you've hit the limit in both directions. You've hit the limit of the essence of what it means to mediate, what it means to extract a simulation and convey, and you've hit the limit of what it means to play with different ways of forming media. We used to get very excited that we could take we could convert language into text. We could make that transition. It was such a huge deal. We really thought of it as being its own kind of object. What I'm saying is that digital reveals that there's just two moves, and both moves are critical, but they're fundamentally the same basic, conserved every time. That one is the essence of foregrounding and backgrounding, of modeling, of a map. And the second is the the particularities of some given transformation of mediation across form, right? And so we know that the forms matter, and we know that the fundamental movement of mapping matters. And when we reach digital, we actually reach the Platonic form of that, and we're done, right? That's it. So that the quality that becomes more is a little bit like the story of from rhythm to tone.
Well, I see something, and I don't know if it maps onto that metaphor. You and I have talked about this is unlike other things in that all the old boundaries get crossed. This is neither like speaking nor writing. It has, right, what we're doing right now is like speaking together, but it's also got the permanence of writing, and then it's got something beyond of the hyper conversation that emerges, right? And the private and the public are now broken. But I'm hearing something I hadn't heard before, and is that the distinction between the intelligence and the medium is now breaking down. Because if it's doing what you're saying, this medium or this meta medium, right? It has to be intelligent. It has to be like, right? We've also had this other. There's the speaker, Shannon. There's the sender. There's the channel, and there's the receiver. But if what you're saying is correct, that's gone. Right, because it's doing all if we get to this point, and we're both it's doing the relevance realization, it's doing and it's exploring on its own. It has to be doing all of this to have that capacity you're talking about, and it sounds like even that distinction, the distinction we used to have between the intelligent sender and the signal, is also breaking down. Where I saw this quite a while ago, was it 2013, 2014, people worrying, trying to get data security. And the move that was being made, and that's why they invited me to the conference, was people were realizing you can't protect information unless you make it intelligent and self-protective. We're the period in which we could sort of lock information by putting like locks around it and protective structures is breaking down, because the stuff that comes at it is going to be like wickedly intelligent, which is we're now in that time. We're in that time. And so the information has to be integrated with a counterintelligence that is basically like an immune system that, and so I'm hearing that in addition to the ones we've already explored, you're proposing that what this Platonic, it's Aristotelian because it's embodied, what this Aristotelian completion of the medium is, it's breaking down the difference between writing and speaking that so upset Plato. It's breaking down the public and the private, that the Enlightenment was predicated on. And now it's breaking down the distinction between the intelligence and the medium in a profound way. And then what I hear you saying is we've built up a grammar of understanding ourselves based on these distinctions. They're kind of like dimensions, and that's all collapsing. And that's what's radically qualitatively new. Is that landing? Am I getting it?
Yeah, let's just keep hammering on that. So we have things like this notion of the Aristotelian form, which I'm quite liking. We have a velocity. And so in the past, whenever a big disruption would come, let's just go say the book, with thousands of years would take place as that new possibility is integrated. But of course, as we move into this new form, it goes vertical. And so the rate of the exploration of the possibility continues to radically outstrips any notion that old model of adaptation is going to happen. This is if we're going to make it, we have to actually come to a new thing than something like a limping along adaptation that we've used so far. And as you're saying, there's like the dimension of we can migrate in the concern of what happens as you begin to see what actually is the area under the curve. And this is the characteristic of something like intelligence. But it's contained there, right? The space of all modeling is contained there. All mechanisms whereby a simulation of complex reality can be produced and can be used to predict future states. Right? The thing that we so pride ourselves in being able to do as intelligent beings. It's all contained in there, right? All of that whole thing. And in many ways, it will outstrip our facility with that to a qualitative level. And so, of course, that part of the conversation has come in from a different direction, but the point is we're bringing it into this conversation, saying why. And we're actually talking about something like the ultima. And while we're there, if you don't mind, I'd actually like to remind us of the thematic of this what do you call it, series that you're in, which is the notion of transcendent naturalism.
Yes.
And to some extent, the bringing of spirituality, and I'm going to propose, by the way, religio, into relationship with all the other human faculties. And things like ultima, things like ultimate, are of that category. You can't deal with the infinite even in science. Like science actually can't deal with infinities. This is why the renormalization thing had to happen in physics. You can't deal with ultimates. Ultimate is actually a different kind of thing.
Yes.
But now if we're actually dealing with the ultimate with regard to this kind of a moment in reality, it will actually require a different toolkit. And we're actually dealing, I think I've said this in a previous set of conversations, that from my point of view, theology and the mode of the sacred are actually the proper approach to this thing called AI.
That's how I've made that argument too. I've made that argument.
If at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the last bit there, which had a technical difficulty, is that we're moving very much into this field where we're actually going to have to start wrestling with things that we can't renormalize. And we're dealing with things like the infinite. We're dealing with things like ultimates. And the proper toolkit for that lives over in the category known as theology. And the proper way of being in relationship with that lives in the disposition that I'll call the sacred. And I've often thought of the sacred in terms of a relationship or disposition more than a noun. In fact, I would even argue, to use some of the previous language, that thinking of the sacred in terms of a noun is a trade language profanity. That if we're actually operating in the mode of the sacred language, we know that the sacred is actually a way of being in relationship with the world first, and then how you behave and act second. And that there are places and things and ideas that so fully call forth that way of being in relationship, and so fully remind us, and so fully a consequence of it, that it embodies us, it brings us into, it sort of resonates with us and brings us into that place. But it's both, but it's more about relationship by far than it is about a given thing is quote unquote sacred.
So I want to pick up on this because this touches on a lot, as I was mentioning, and so it might have got garbled for you. In the video essay I did on AI, I also proposed that theology is going to become important because we're going to have to place more and more emphasis on what I call the spiritual somatic dimension of our existence. Because, as you rightly argued, in what you've already said, the areas we thought we could place our identity in, the effable areas, the propositionalizable areas, we're going to fall behind on them very rapidly. But those that put us into that ineffable religio, orientation, binding to what is ultimate, Tillich's ultimate concern for ultimate reality, which is his definition of faith, I think they come to prominence. I wonder if the argument could be tightened a little. And I'm not saying this because I think your argument is not rigorous. I just mean explicated, in the sense that it seems to me that as this Aristotelian form of media comes into full existence, and as it breaks down a lot of the cognitive grammatical boundaries and structures that we've created, especially post-Enlightenment, and as it makes us confront things that, I'll use your word because I like it, are ultimate and therefore call for our sacred capacity, is there not the fact that we will have, so for example, I'm thinking that as the boundaries break down, the human capacity for the realization in both senses of the word of non-duality, and the kind of work that Nicholas of Cusa did with the the coincidence of opposites. The infinite circle is also a straight line, and that multidimensional. And the point is not closure. He says if you try to close it, you're still behind the wall. You break through to learned ignorance. You break through to that right relationship rather than being right. And I'm just saying, I see that it will open us up to ultimates again, but it also seems to me that by breaking the grammar, right, it's going to break the subject predicate grammar, really, really powerful. It's going to so although it may be the Aristotelian form, right, of media, it's going to break the subject predicate grammar that's behind substance ontology. That's Aristotle. The world is divided up into subjects and predicates, right? It's like, oh, wow, look at this. Look at what we now have, and it doesn't work that way. And I'm wondering that, I'm not claiming that the Aristotelian form of the media instantiates sacredness, although I think there's going to be a terrific temptation for people to relate to it that way. And I've already articulated that. I think what it does, right, is it can become something like the spiritual exercises that Nicholas of Cusa talked about, because now non-duality and paradoxical infinities and the breakdown of the subject predicate and stuff going from the infinitesimal to the infinite, all of this is no longer something that some crazy monk was doing over there. It is the world now. And that seems to me like I say, I'm trying to strengthen your argument by saying the confrontation, the existential confrontation with the kind of being that the Aristotelian form of the of media will itself trigger spiritual exercises. And there's another bifurcation point. We can either be tempted to worshiping the multimedia machine, or we can be Sophroson. We could be tempted to the good. We could be tempted to no. This just gives me better ways of unlocking my capacity to come into relationship to what is ultimate. And that's the proposal I wanted to put down there. That if we explicate what you've proposed in the way I've done, I think we get to a chirotic decision point where we are tempted. I mean, this is almost mythological. We're tempted to heaven and we're tempted to hell. If hell is what happens when you get into profound idolatry, at least that's what Dante thought, right?
I was going to say, the language of idolatry was coming to my mind. Right? We are absolutely going to be tempted with the most potent form of idolatry imaginable. We will literally have concrete objects of vastly more power than us that will actually be able to seduce us into giving us the things that we think we want, if only we, right? It's going to be a very sort of hyper pagan, because it's not the least bit symbolic. Maybe anti-symbolic now that I think about it. So there you go. Now, what I also noticed was something like the transcendent qua transcendent, or the notion of the ultima qua ultima. So we have the notion of to self-transcend, right? To be in a box, the 9-dot problem, and then to transcend that box into some new location. But if I contemplate one level above that, which is what affords that possibility at all, the transcendent qua transcendent, now we're in that category, which is the ineffable. By the way, Greg, I can't believe you didn't say it like John set it up. Is the effable is going to be effed. All right, so back to the ineffable. The realm where mystery is, like the place from whence we have the notion of the mysterious in its essence, right? That category over there that we can call the transcendent, not to transcend, but the place from which the notions of transcendence in general come, is the thing, right? If we move towards the only thing that's the answer from idolatry is the answer of moving into the mystery, where we haven't even the capability of grabbing a hold of something to which we can enslave ourselves. Now I actually notice myself moving all the way back downstream to some of the stories like the integration of the metamyth. Is it metamyth or monomyth? Which one is it?
I've heard both used. Monomyth because it's cross-cultural, and metamyth because it's sort of above all particular mythical stories.
So let's just do the same thing. Like, let's just take that story of saying, okay, in just the same way we've now had this historical arc of a search across media space, and we're reaching the end of that. In that same arc, we've also been having search across mythology space. And we're now reaching the point where we have to do the same kind of work that Gregg was proposing that we would have to do around something like Sibium, where there's clearly an attractor that has been pulling these narratives in a particular direction. Right? There's something happening at the level of the ontic that provides us with a transcendent or invariant across all transformations in space and time geometry of, say, for example, the good or proper behavior or virtue. And we've been sort of discovering them haptically as we've been moving through culture space. And now we're actually at a moment where we can look at that and go, you probably did in your last two calls, whoa, this is what's happening. And so what we can now do is just a very powerful medium. Let's take that and just bring it all the way to its ultimate. What does it look like for us to design or identify or project or follow the path of this dimensionality? And again, that's the content of a proper religion, coming out of the realm of the transcendent, grounded in the ineffable and in the mystery, and yet nonetheless giving us an ontic ground that is actually invariant across all transformations in space and time, that will guide us in our choices, that will allow us to make effective choices under any possible context. And just to make a fine point on it, under the power of exponential technology, the only way to actually make any kind of choice is you have to have things that are grounded in, say, the infinite. Maybe quite specifically the infinite, right? If something's going like this, I'm exploring the Leibnizian explosion where I have an asymptote of the finite getting closer and closer and closer to the infinite. And if I try to race with that by getting smarter and smarter on this curve, the formal term for that is I'm fucked. But if I'm in the infinite qua infinite, then this is in fact always infinitely far away from it, and I'm actually perfectly good to go.
But this parallels a move that happened in the history of Neoplatonism, right? And so I'm suggesting we take a look there for maybe some help, because I mean, if you look in Plato and the early Neoplatonists, including Plotinus, infinity is bad. Infinity is the lack of definition. It is the lack of intelligibility. It is the lack. It is privation. It is chaos. It is what evil is. And what happens, right, is as you move into Christian Neoplatonism and you get to it starts to open up with Proclus, who's a pagan, but you see it full blown in the Christian Neoplatonists, and it comes to fruition in people like Erigena and especially Nicholas of Cusa. You got you get the good infinite, and you get the idea now of God as what Jordan was just proposing, that God is, right, the affordance of infinite self-transcendence. Like God is that field affordance, pure relationality that makes all transcendence by any finite being, wherever, whatever, for however long possible. And that and Cusa's getting us to try and orient towards the positive infinitive as the inexhaustible source of intelligibility that can continually fuel all possible forms of transcendence. That actually happened in the history of Neoplatonism. I'm reading a book right now on how there was this sort of choice point where we went down we came out of Plato and we had Aristotle and the Neoplatonists, and with Aristotle we had the subject predicate logic ontology, and that became dominant. But the Neoplatonists were arguing for a fundamental, all the way down, relational ontology, which is what you've been talking about. And so there's a lot there. And why that matters is, for me, that means that we like what we're proposing, like there are, again, cross-culturally, philosophical Silk Road, there are patterns of enacting this ontically, rituals and ways of discourse and ways of communication, which is really interesting because it's different than the trade language that you were talking about. What's going on in the Silk Road is what I call something like the lingua philosophica, which was this Neoplatonism that allowed people to move into a joint appreciation of the ineffable, right? And so I think there's something there that we could pay attention to, because if I'm not saying that, I'm not being nostalgic, no, neither nostalgia nor utopia, but there's a lot of thought into exact. Sorry, Jordan, I don't mean to be taking anything from you. I'm trying to actually. Okay, good. There's a tradition, cross-historically, cross-religion, cross-geographical territory of reflection on exactly the proposal you're making. There's a rich legacy and heritage for us there. That's what I'm saying.
Just so we can be clear, I have no notion that I'm thinking anything that hasn't been thought before. It's quite likely everything I'm saying has been said much better by other people. I don't particularly make any claim to being rigorous. I actually was asked to give a keynote at the Santa Fe Institute, and the preamble was, guys, I'm not rigorous. That's your gig. I'm here to be provocative. I'm here to stir things up, to shake things up, bring new ideas in, so that the fecundity of your rigor has something to work with to bring it apart. And by the way,
Jordan, just to intervene.
You're not going to insult but shock me, so run.
Yeah, I get what you mean by not rigorous. You're not bound to sort of strict logicality, but you're still careful, right? And that's something that's important. I want to put a pin in this because you exemplify that, and I think this is actually relevant to what we're talking about here. There is a way to be very careful, like Socratic care. It isn't bound to subject predicate notions of rigor. I think it's important to note that, right? And you're so yes, I get what you're saying, and I'm not trying to backhand it away, but I want to say that, but there's a positive framing on what you just said. It's like, yeah, but look, there's a way of being relationally very, very careful, and I'm demonstrating it. So I just wanted to, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I thought that was a point worth making.
So what was coming through my mind when you were describing just a moment ago was something along the lines of events that have different durations to play themselves out. Right? So let's say we have this long arc that includes things like the playing out of the implications of mind and media. And we have the long arc of the playing out of the implications of how that shows up in terms of cities and the energy of cities. And by the way, the socio-anthropological consequences of what happens that creates conflicts and arms races and things like that. So there's a whole arc. Now let's say, for example, that's playing out, and let's go with 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, something new dropped in that was beginning to send out its own ripples.
Yes.
And those ripples are happening in the context of this larger arc, right? So it's not necessarily nostalgia as much as it is just remembering, and almost like, sorry, this is exactly right. How funny is this? Once upon a time, I was trying to paddle out into some very big surf, and I couldn't figure out how to get the right angle to get it. And then this dude came out, and he looked at it, and he looked at it, and he noticed that there was a cliff, and the waves were hitting the cliff, and as they would, they were reflecting back out. So he actually timed the reflection wave, jumped on right past the cliff on the reflection wave, which pulled him right back out through the water, and then he just popped into the lineup. This is something like that, right? We have waves that are heading this way towards the fifth joint point with a huge potent logic. We have this other set of waves that dropped in here that are happening in the sacred domain. And I'm delighted to hear that the Christian Neoplatonists dialed into this back in that time frame. That sounds extremely right. And in some sense, our job is to find those waves and find the waves that are in the moving in the right direction, and then just ride them, noticing that it took 2,000 years to work out the implications of all this other stuff. Fair enough.
Yeah, and it's not just the Christian Neoplatonists; it's the Islamic, it's Sufism, and there's interactions. Right. The Silk Road was very properly, in your sense, the commons in a profound way. Nobody owns the Silk Road. People try to own pieces, but if they try and hold the pieces separate from each other, it breaks down. Everybody has to agree that it's like what's happening here is held in common. And see, that's what's so exciting about this, because it has the capacity to, it's got the proven track record in Zen, and that's why I want to try and bring Zen and Neoplatonism together. They both have this proven track record of being able to enter into reciprocal reconstruction with almost anything they come into contact with. And we not so much for Zen, but we have clear evidence that Neoplatonism can do this readily with science too. And that brings us sort of back to this argument, like that we can wed like there's an opportunity at the fifth joint point to see a profound new possibility. You've added a powerful dimension. You've really explicated, unpacked the fifth joint point, and why it both affords and demands a consilience between science and spirituality. That's what I've heard coming out of all of this.
Very much so. Yeah.
I propose that we end it there. I'll let Greg give it any final comments, and then you have.
Well, I'll just say I basically will have named, as I attended to the fifth joint point, I named it the digital identity problem, where the digital's the techno environment and then ultimate digital medium problem, and the identity is our knowing mental facility, and we need to get the right rotation on that to generate a digital identity solution. It's a transfer. We need to rotate our identities in right relation. And Jordan, when you were talking about catching those waves and finding the right between a trade language and between the sacred language and holding that identity that grounds us in a particular way, but also recognizes that potential, the rotation of that is very the felt embodied enactment of that rotation on our identity is essentially, I would say, a wonderful depiction of what I was intuiting there. So that resonated.
So, Jordan, we always give our guests, you're going to come back for another episode and we can continue to unpack this and some of its consequences. But we always give our guests the last word. It can be summative, it can be provocative, it could be
it could be an expletive.
it could be stay tuned for the neat thing that's coming. But we give you the chance to have the final word. But before you do that, on behalf of myself and Greg, I want to really thank you. This was incredibly rich. Like I'm like really fired, and I'm seeing a deep convergence about what you're talking about and this work I've been trying to do about walking the philosophical Silk Road, and I find it very exciting. So I just wanted to also thank you.
You're welcome. I'm sure that your memory or understanding of Greek grammar is better than mine. What is the category of grammar? I think it's called the vocative, like ho theos.
There's the middle voice. Yeah. I think
the one where you're actually calling forth.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll be vocative.
Okay.
I will request of that which is being called forth on the other side of the fifth joint point, that which calls us forth in the infinite that allows and affords our continual transcendence, to guide us in the contemplation and the metabolism of what's happened today, yes, so that our next conversation can continue to move us along that way, right? Move us in that direction, and we can build and build and build.
Yes, I share your invocation, your prophetic prayer. I share that very much. Thank you, my friends. This has been really wonderful.